Hello, welcome back. So today I want to share a very simple, quick insight that I learned pretty early on in my coaching career that I think can be helpful for anyone who is also a coach or a manager, or honestly, if you have any sort of relationship with other people. I think that remembering this can be very helpful. Before I share what that is, please make sure you're subscribed. If you haven't yet subscribed, please share this video if you find it useful. That's the best way to help this channel grow. And if you're looking for holiday gift ideas, don't forget to check out my new online shop. powerfulemployees.com/shop has a number of products, including mugs, calendars, and little trinkets like that have my original poetry verses on them. And I also have my poetry book, Create and Receive, Make and Believe, Finding Peace Through Primarily Positive Poetry, available on Amazon if you're interested in checking that out or giving it as a gift, because the one piece of feedback I've gotten most often is, this would make a fabulous gift book, because it looks nice on a coffee table and it's full of inspirational, positive, motivational messages. So just some ideas if you're out there holiday shopping. So what I want to talk about today is the very simple concept that people learn and change when they are ready. One thing I noticed while I was coaching is I would give people advice multiple times. They could come in for 10 sessions and I'd say the same thing every time. And it wasn't until multiple sessions later, they came in one day and said, "Oh my gosh, Trisha, I had the biggest insight," and then tell me the thing I'd been telling them for weeks. It wasn't until they had that moment that their behavior actually shifted, that they actually started to take the advice. So in this case, it was, as a speech coach, I was telling people that you have a lot more control over your speech when you're able to slow down. And I would say that literally every session in 600 different ways. And then inevitably, this has happened with almost every client, they'll come in one day and say, "Oh my gosh, Trisha, you'll never guess what I just realized. Like, if I just slow down, it's so much easier." And at first, when that happened, I was like, yeah, that's what I've been telling you all along. But then I realized to celebrate them. It's better to just celebrate them and say, yeah, I'm so glad that you reached that insight on your own. Because here's the thing. I've read that we as people need to hear something an average of 52 times before it actually sticks. And we don't actually change our behavior until we decide to change, until it clicks in our minds. So think of an experience that you've had where someone has maybe told you something a million times, but you just didn't listen, and then one day it clicked. Or that cliche that you'd always heard but not really paid much attention to finally clicked. And you had that light bulb moment, and you think, "Oh my gosh, I'm a genius, that's profound." And then you realize people have been saying this for thousands of years, and it's nothing new, and people have been telling you that for maybe your whole life, but it never registered. And I'm bringing this up because it's so important to remember that everyone is on their own path and everyone is in their own brain. So I used to get a little frustrated when it felt like they weren't taking my advice, they weren't listening to what I had to say, they weren't trusting me. But then I realized it's not their fault. It didn't click in the way that it needed to for them to actually change their behavior. And I think sometimes we coerce that click to happen by actually engaging in the behavior. So part of my coaching, for example, is I would force my clients to do exercises that would make them slow down, and by virtue of doing so, they would see the benefit and they would realize how helpful it is. Just like if you're going to the gym, you may have to kind of force yourself in the beginning until one day it clicks and you're like, whoa, I feel so much better doing this. I want to keep going. And so the motivation becomes internal. So this is not to suggest that we never listen to advice and that we can't reach our own conclusions after listening to what other people say. In fact, hearing it a number of times is what leads to that internal motivation to change. But without the internal motivation, all the advice in the world can only go so far. So I think this is incredibly powerful to keep in mind anytime you're trying to convince someone to do something, or if you're trying to help someone see something a certain way. If you're telling your friend, like, hey, maybe going on that date isn't a good idea because you've said 17 times you're not interested, it's up to that person to make the decision for themselves. But you can still offer your opinion in a way that is kind and is showing your compassion for them. You're not trying to control or manipulate their behavior, but you're offering what you see from an outside perspective, because that is incredibly helpful. That is why coaches exist and therapists, is so people can get an outside perspective, because if we all only live in our own brain all the time, it's very hard to notice our own blind spots. At the same time, if you as a friend are giving advice to your other friend and they're not taking your advice, don't take it personally. It's not about you. It's not them trying to spite you. If you are a parent telling your child to do something or asking your child to do something and they're not listening, I mean, this is depending on the age of the child, of course, but let's say you're talking to an adult child and they're not listening, maybe they're just not ready to hear it yet, and they need to come to that conclusion themselves. And eventually they will grow up and learn and say, oh my gosh, mom was right. That's a cliche for a reason, because it often happens. But we have to reach that conclusion on our own, I believe, for it to really stick. Otherwise, we may go through the motions, we may make the changes, but it's not usually sustainable if we're doing it for someone else, and then we might build up resentment towards them if we're doing it exclusively for somebody else rather than for ourselves. I can think, for example, of so many people who are such incredibly talented musicians or singers or dancers, and they said they hate it because they were forced to take all these lessons as a child and then they stopped. Or sports, where I know someone who loved tennis as a child and growing up loved it, but then as soon as they became an adult, moved out of the house, they stopped playing forever because they were like, it was shoved down my throat, it was forced upon me, and I don't want to do it anymore. So there is a balance to be had. Sometimes I wish my mom had pushed me a little harder to do lessons as a child, because I never had any sort of training in anything. I didn't play sports, I didn't do dance, I didn't do drama, I didn't do anything except play with Barbies and my neighbors, which is fine, but I think my mom's fear was going too far in that other direction of making me do something I wasn't comfortable with. And of course, there's a balance to be had, and it's different, again, when you're working with young children. But in your adult relationships, the one thing I want to harp on is remember that they're an adult and they will come to the conclusion when it's right for them, if it's right for them. Sometimes the things that we think would really be helpful for that person to know, and we say, oh, I just wish they could see this, that might not be what's best for them. But if it is best for them, they will reach that conclusion eventually. We can help them by repeating it over and over. So if someone has to hear something 52 times on average for it to really click, then my job as a coach is to say it as many times as I can every time I see them. Say, hey, remember to slow down. And one day it will click in their day-to-day, and then they'll come to me and say, Trisha, you'll never guess what just happened. I slowed down and it was miraculous, or whatever the case may be. But the thing that we can all keep in mind is to not get frustrated if other people aren't doing what we say, if they're not taking our advice, if they don't seem to be learning what we're trying to teach, remembering that they have their own process. This can also be incredibly helpful in relationships, romantic or friendship or business relationships. Anytime you're wanting someone to change their behavior, it is far more effective to inspire someone to want to change their behavior than to nag them to do it, or to hope that they'll do it, or to will that they'll do it. If you inspire them in a way that makes them think that changing their behavior was their idea, they're more likely to do it than if they just do it because you've told them so many times that then they eventually give in. For example, I was thinking, my mom asked me for Christmas gift ideas, and I've really been wanting a little a spice rack, like something to hold all my spices, because the one I have is just a little disorganized and I wanted something a little nicer. But the challenge is my counter space where I want to keep my spices is relatively narrow. And so I haven't been able to find one online or in stores that fits that space. And the one that I did find is the one I have now, and I don't love it. And so I was talking to my mom and I was saying maybe my dad could make one because he likes woodworking. He likes doing that kind of stuff. And she like rolled her eyes. She said, he's not going to do that. He would only do that if he thinks it's his idea. Like if he came up with the idea himself, he would be super excited. I'm not going to ask him to do it, but if I really wanted to, what I could do is talk about, oh, man, I really wish I had this spice rack that was made of wood and fit these dimensions and maybe custom, but I can't seem to find one, and I think it'd be pretty simple to make, but I just can't find anyone, which I know sounds maybe a little manipulative. So this isn't a little of an extreme example, but by doing something like that, if my dad organically came up with the idea of, why don't I make one for you, darling? Then there we go. But again, that's a little extreme. I'm not trying to sound manipulative or like you want to use this in a way to get people to do things you want. But just an example to illustrate, if we inspire other people to change, for example, by saying, oh my gosh, I love it so much when you put the dishes away or you bring me flowers or whatever it is, that's more likely to lead to that person doing that behavior again than saying, oh my gosh, you never bring me flowers, or can you ever put the dishes away? Because they're not going to feel intrinsically motivated. They're going to feel like they're doing it from pressure, external pressure. So all of this is to say, if you are teaching or mentoring or giving advice to friends, remember that they are likely not going to change their behavior until they are ready. And when they are ready, don't be upset that they didn't listen to you sooner. Just be excited for them is my recommendation, because there's only so much you can do, and likely you want to help, you want to encourage them, you want to share things that you know will be helpful for them, but at the end of the day, it's their decision, it's their body, it's their life. And this unattachment from their behavior, I find so liberating. This is something I've talked about before, but my mom being terminally ill, there are a lot of behaviors that I wish she would change. And I think, if you maybe ate these foods or did this thing, I'm not going to say exercise, she exercises way too much. Maybe if you exercise a little less. And there's so many adjustments I would suggest based on things that I read, but I realized very early on that it is her body and it is her life. And I can give gentle suggestions of, oh, I read this article that says that blah, blah, blah helps with blah, blah, blah. Sometimes she has listened and she ordered an herb from China because of an article I found. But other times she'll say, like, no, I don't want to do that. And I have to respect that, even though it can feel frustrating, because I really believe it could help her feel better and recover and heal. But it's her life. And once we are comfortable detaching, but still caring, I still care very much about my mother and her health and her well-being, and I cannot be so attached to her doing what I say because it's ultimately not my decision. And that's when our compassion can turn into control. And so when we learn to strike that balance of caring about someone, offering to help, but not going so far to the extreme that we're trying to control or manipulate their behavior, then I think it's better for everyone in the long run. So I hope you find that helpful. If you haven't yet checked out my online course, it is called Show Up Sure, Secrets to Embody Confidence for a Lifetime. It is a self-paced online course designed to help you improve your confidence, particularly around speaking and interacting with other people, but confidence in general as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.